On May 12th, nearly 2 months ago, we gathered on Sunday, and after singing and praying together, I introduced our sermon series through the book of Job and read chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And in that first sermon, we examined chapters 1 and 2, where we had the privilege, the opportunity to peer into heaven as a council convened, a council that included a character named Satan, or translated literally, the Satan. And we heard God commend Job to Satan. Job 1:8, and the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" And this sets off the whole storyline of Job as Satan sneers at God's description of his beloved servant, insisting that Job only loved God because God had blessed him with material prosperity. And Job does seem to be about as prosperous and wealthy as anyone in the world at that point in history. Well, God takes Satan up on the challenge and allows Job to be tested. And over the course of 2 days, everything that is dear in this world to Job is stripped away. His livelihood, all 10 of his children dead, his body racked with infection. And yet, this remarkable man, we find him in the face of devastation declaring, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And as we leave chapter 2, Job begins to cry out to heaven in lament for the disaster that is his life. And for the next 36 chapters, as Job argues with his friends about the reason for his suffering and what God is up to, there is one figure amidst all the conversation and argument and discussion. There is one figure that seems completely absent, seems completely silent. And that would be God himself. We have listened in over the course of our study of this book on Job's 3 unhelpful friends, accusing Job of secret sin, because in their theological worldview, if someone is suffering, it must be God's judgment against sin in their lives. And one way of describing this is the retribution principle. Do good and you'll be blessed, sin and you'll be punished. Now, there is something theologically orthodox in their doctrine of sowing and reaping, but their orthodox theology is insufficient and misapplied. And we have heard Job over and over again protesting against their presumptuous and misinformed arguments. And Job's protests are not only against his friends' unhelpful counsel, we have found Job crying out to God to give an answer to him for why he is suffering. Job 23:3 and following. "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know that he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would pay attention to me." Or Job 31:35, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary." And last week we saw that after 6 chapters of Job's friend Elihu's input, including Elihu's exhortation to behold the justice, the greatness, and the majesty of God, we find Elihu in chapter 37, verse 14 say, "Hear this, O Job, stop and consider the wondrous works of God." So now the stage has been set. And this morning, we arrive at the inflection point in this book of divinely inspired wisdom, because as we come to Job chapter 38, we find ourselves at the moment we have all been waiting for over the last 2 months. Because in Job 38, God himself arrives on the scene to answer Job. What will he say? Will he answer all of Job's agonizing why questions? Will he explain to Job what happened in chapters 1 and 2? What is God's revelation to his suffering servant, Job? Well, let's find out. As I begin reading in Job chapter 38, verse 1, let me invite you to stand in reverence, because we are about to be addressed by God himself through his word. Job chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And where is the place of darkness, that you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. You may be seated, and may God bless the preaching of his holy word. So, were you surprised? Were you surprised to hear the content of God's response to all of Job's appeals for an explanation for why he was suffering so terribly? Because notice, God does not provide an explanation. No, he responds rather than providing the explanation of chapters 1 and 2. He responds by interrogating Job with a series of rhetorical questions. And here's what we will learn this morning as we examine God's response to Job this week and next Sunday, that what we need most in suffering is not answers to our agonizing why questions or even relief from suffering. It's not what we need most. No, what we need most in suffering is God himself. And for us to honor and reverence and delight in him above all else, and entrust our lives to his perfect wisdom. And so this week and next, we will hear God personally address Job. Time will not permit us to read every verse in chapters 38 through 42 over the course of these 2 Sundays. So let me encourage you to take time this week to slowly and carefully read these chapters in full. My outline is simple this morning, 2 points. First point, God speaks. Second point, Job humbles himself. So verse 1. Point 1, God speaks. Verse 1. We've been following along with all of the arguments and the protests, and finally here in verse 1, then the Lord himself answered Job out of the whirlwind. This is the voice that Job has been aching to hear. This is the voice that Job needs to hear most. And as we look at God's response to Job, we might find ourselves thinking, well, Job, I think you might ask for it. But notice in verse 1, it's the Lord who speaks to Job. And notice the Lord is in all caps. Do you see that? That's significant. This is the first time in the book we've seen God referred to as the Lord, all caps. Hebrew scholars help us understand that throughout the course of the book of Job, God is named in the Hebrew as Shaddai, God Almighty. But here in chapter 38, we read that all caps, the Lord answered Job. And whenever we see the Lord in all caps, we are to understand that this is the name of God, Yahweh. This is the covenant, promise-keeping God revealed to Abraham and later to Moses as God revealed himself to his people as the God who makes and keeps promises of his steadfast love and faithfulness. It's important to note, Yahweh responds to Job. The covenant-making, covenant-keeping God speaks to Job. And that means that though what God says is weighty, it's intense, he's not being vindictive. God loves Job. God is committed to Job. And so Yahweh speaks to Job out of a fierce wind. Note, Job was attempting to summon the Lord to respond to his protests and questions. We find here instead that now Job has been summoned by God to answer some questions. Verse 2. Who is this? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Who is this, Job, that addresses me in ignorance? Dress for action like a man, Job. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Now, if you're like me, you can easily and immediately envision Job shrinking in his sandals, averting his gaze. But God won't allow that, because he continues to go on to invite Job to look up and look around as he begins a series of rhetorical questions. Starting in verse 4, God interrogates Job. Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Job, where were you at the dawn of creation when I created the heavens and the earth out of nothing? Where were you, Job, when at the dawn of creation the sons of God, those heavenly figures introduced in chapter 1, where were you when they shouted for joy in the presence of the Lord as I created all things? In verse 8, the Lord turns to the realities of chaos and evil. Who shut the sea with doors? Understand, the sea was symbolic to the Hebrews as the place of chaos and evil. So tell me, Job, were you present when I set up boundaries for the evil and chaos of this world? When I prescribed limits for it, verse 10, declaring, thus far shall you come and no farther? I think you hear in the Lord of the Rings an echo in Gandalf standing in the presence of pure evil and declaring, you shall not pass. Verse 17. Hey, Job, have the gates of hell or death been revealed to you? Job, tell me, Job, tell me all about your expertise when it comes to interacting with the afterlife. How was your last visit to Sheol, the realm of the dead, Job? And so we find, most unexpectedly, that God's response to Job's protests and prayers is to take Job on a walk throughout his creation. Verses 4 through 21, he calls Job to consider the origins of the universe, and he continues in verses 22 through 28, calling Job to consider the weather, the world of meteorology. Look at verse 22. Job, have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Job, talk to me about how you have access to and control over the weather, snow and the hail and the wind. Listen, forget the possibility of controlling the weather. Thousands of years later, we have weathermen and apps that can barely get a forecast correct. Yeah. I mean, how many times have we seen a forecast of significant snow only to wake up to a light dusting? And furthermore, we are powerless against the cruel ravages of the weather. Scholars inform us that both Napoleon and Hitler discovered their utter lack of control over the elements when in the snowy depths of Russia, both their armies suffered heavier losses because of the bitter cold than because of enemy action. He goes on, verses 31 through 33. Hey, Job, consider the constellations. Pleiades, Orion, and so forth. Tell me, Job, Tell me about how you arrange the stars of heaven with such majesty. Talk to me about that, Job. He goes on, verse 34 through 36. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? Job, can you create thunderstorms and lightning? Hey, Job, tell me, can you explain how you were able to make human beings intelligent? We can hardly imagine how intimidating this must have been for Job. He's got no answers. And to this day, again, thousands of years later, we have very little understanding at all about how the brain and consciousness works, much less thousands of years ago when this historic conversation was recorded. Listen, for all of our technological advances, any conception of having control over the world is mostly an apparent illusion. There is, some measure, some degree, mostly an illusion. Our control over the creation and over our lives is quite limited. You know, I was born in 77, so I grew up in the 80s. I was a Star Wars kid. And Star Wars kids, here's what we like to do. We like to walk up to a grocery store exit. And before stepping into the sensor, use the Force to open those doors. We are not actually controlling those doors with the Force. And maybe if someone looking on, they may think, oh, wow, amazing. But it's an illusion. And in this world, our ability to control the world and our lives is significantly limited. A lot of us think a lot more of ourselves and our ability to be able to do that than others. It's almost all out of our control. And suffering is a way that God wakes us up to show us just how insufficient and how much we are not in control. Listen, when the Caribbean last week was facing a Category 5 hurricane, I assure you those folks did not have any thought of taking control over their environment. Verse 39 through the end of chapter 39. God pivots away from questions about the creation of the earth and the elements, and in effect, as one friend of mine put it, he now invites Job to come with him to the zoo. And God begins to question him about the animal kingdom. Look at chapter 38, verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their thicket? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? God is reminding Job that God is intimately involved all the way down to animals getting something to eat. There is not some evolutionary-based circle of life. No, God is involved in all the details. Did not Jesus say in Matthew chapter 6 that the Father feeds the birds and makes the lilies grow? Furthermore, if he cares for them, Jesus says, how much more does he care and provide for his children? Chapter 39, verse 1. God questions Job's understanding of the passage of time. Verse 1, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bring forth their offspring, and are delivered of their young? Christopher Ash, in his wonderful commentary on Job, succinctly gives us this insight. Job needs to learn, and we need to learn, to entrust ourselves to the righteous Lord of time. Listen, God is not on our timeline. We are on God's timeline. You know, in the office, we sync our calendars, our online calendars together so that I can jump on Google Calendar and I can see what Kevin's up to or Kathy's up to. Here's the deal. Our calendars are synced in one way. He can see all of ours. We can't see his. Verses 5 through 12, God calls Job to consider the wild donkey and the wild ox. Tell me, Job, are you able to approach those wild animals and just summon them to obey you and serve you? And then we come to the ostrich. Did you notice the ostrich? Chapter 39, verses 13 through 18. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that the wild beast may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young as if they were not hers. Though her labor be in vain, yet she has no fear, because God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and his rider. Now, this is about a lengthy description of an animal as God provides through these chapters. And so he wants us to get something here as he describes the ostrich. So we'll pause real quick. Let's consider this strange bird, because the ostrich gets somewhat of a tough beat as far as I can tell. It has very large wings, but it can't fly. And the ostrich is a moron. The ostrich is the epitome of having a bird brain. I mean, she forgets about the eggs she's laid and carelessly puts them out on the ground for others to trample on them, or perhaps herself trample on. Verse 17, we read, we get understanding. Why is this bird so dumb? Verse 17, the ostrich is an idiot because God created it to be so. Look at 17. God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. And it can't fly, but it runs so fast that she laughs at a galloping horse as she flies by him. I mean, this is a strange bird. Why does God bring up the ostrich, this peculiar, strange bird? Here's why. Job's friends throughout this book have been trying to contain God's working in the world to that retribution principle. You do good, you get blessed. You sin, you get judged. That is kind of the scope, the limit of their view of God's working in the world. But the ostrich serves us to inform a different way of understanding God. And so Douglas O'Donnell in his commentary says, why would God create such a creature? The existence of the awkward, ugly, and odd ostrich is a visual reminder that God's ways are mysterious and is a rebuttal of the retribution principle's tidy system of theology. There is nothing logical about this powerful but silly bird. And so God, in the mystery of his wisdom and power and providence and for his glory, was pleased to make all things, even silly animals, as well as fierce ones, which all bring him glory, which turns us to our next animal, verses 19 through 25. God directs Job's attention to the war horse, an animal that in that time was a fierce weapon of war. In ancient history, the war house was an elite weapon, and an army with war horses would have been a terrifying opponent. He says in chapter 39, verse 19, do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws the valley and exalts in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver, the flashing spear, and the javelin. With fierceness and rage, he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, aha! He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains, and the shouting. So, Job, just consider this one animal. Did you bring this fierce, majestic, terrible creature into existence and give the horse his might? I mean, one can clearly envision just Job making himself as small as possible. In verses 26 through 30, God concludes his tour of creation by calling Job to consider the birds of prey, the hawk and the eagle. Job, are you the ones that make the birds of prey to fly? Is it at your command that they make their nest? Job, was it your idea to create eagles to be able to spy out their prey as far as 3 miles away? And then we come to chapter 40, verse 1. The conclusion of this first address from God to Job. And the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. Okay. Why does God respond to Job's demands for an explanation in this way? Why, in response to his suffering why questions, God takes Job on a tour of creation and questions him with these rhetorical and deeply humbling questions? Well, as one scholar notes succinctly, here's the problem. As great as God is to Job, his God is too small. Job has a vision of a great God, his divine friend, but not great enough. And so God is kindly, lovingly putting Job in his place. Job has been evaluating God's dealings with him throughout this book and has repeatedly found fault with God, accusing God of injustice, declaring that God has been unfair to him. And God's response is what he needs most. Because Job needs to behold and hear and understand that God is God, and in his infinite and divine wisdom and power, he is doing 100 trillion things that humanity can hardly perceive. And so glib and hasty assessments that even imply that God is not wise or fair in his dealings with this world are completely out of place, even obscene. And that brings us to our second point. Job humbles himself. So, God names Job as a fault finder. With his protests and questions, he had been contending against the perfect, majestic, holy, and all-wise God of all creation. If you were in Job's shoes, let me ask you, if you were in Job's shoes and were questioned by God like this, how do you think you'd respond? Here's how Job responds. He goes from clamoring and questions to quiet. Look at verse 3. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but I will not proceed, but I will proceed no further. No more protests. No more fault finding. God is transforming Job's perspective on his life and suffering, not by explaining all the reasons for his suffering. Could have done that. Could have explained the story that unfolded in heaven in chapters 1 and 2. We might even ask why he didn't simply explain that. Here's why. It is because God, in his infinite wisdom, knows that what Job needs most in his suffering is a renewed and grand and glorious understanding of the greatness and the goodness and the wisdom of God. Amen. His vision needed to be expanded to allow for the mysteries of God's good and wise authority and sovereign superintending of his creation. In other words, he needs to understand God always knows what he is doing, and what he is doing is always good and wise, no matter what appearances may be. He is the Lord, the covenant God of steadfast love and faithfulness toward his people, including Job, whatever his circumstances. So, what can we transfer and apply to our lives from this interaction between God and his suffering servant, Job? First, in chapter 38, verse 17, God asked Job, if you recall, have the gates of death been revealed to you, Job? Have you walked in the place of death and returned to talk about it? Of course, Job shuts his mouth. He has no answer. He has not. But we remember that there was one to come. There was another suffering servant that has, as Christopher Ash says, unlike Job, we know that one man has now been to and right through the gates of death. He has gone deep into the place of the dead, and he has returned victorious. That terrible place that has been known to God since it began is a place whose sting has been removed and whose terrors need terrify the Christian no more. And listen, though we have the honor and the privilege of in and through Job, listening to God himself speak to Job, there was much more that God intended to speak to the world, because thousands of years later, God would speak definitively to humanity in and through the one who has gone deep into the place of death and has returned victorious. As Hebrews 1:1 says, long ago, in many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. The gospel is God's fullest and final declaration of his mercy and love, because in the gospel, he speaks to us not from a whirlwind, but from a cross. He speaks to us, Father, forgive them. He speaks to us, it is finished. And from the empty tomb, he speaks, declaring life, eternal life, for all who put their faith in him. Rejoice this morning, beloved. Our King has conquered the sting of death. Second, and simply put, our interactions with creation should be informed by these verses. It is right and wise for each one of us, as we observe creation daily through our lives, to understand, to cultivate our attention to the fact that here we are witnessing something of the greatness and goodness and wisdom of God. And so Romans 1:20 says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Let me encourage you, this summer, we're right in the heart of summer, let this text inform your vacation. These verses, this text has the ability to transform your vacation experience this summer. So you stand perhaps in the ocean, looking at its endless expanse, or in the mountains, or in the lush beauty of groves of trees, stargazing at night, observing the constellations. Listen, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. God has embedded his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, ever since the creation of the world and the things have been made. And as God directed Job to observe and cultivate wonder at the power and might and wisdom of God in creation, we do that as well. And listen, parents, as you navigate through this summer and the fall months and the days ahead, and you encounter beauty in creation, direct your children to the glory of God in creation. Furthermore, let them see you wonder and worship. It would serve your kids, mom and dad, observe the glories of creation and give glory to God and worship. So you'll be setting a striking example for your children when they watch mom and dad wonder and worship on vacation, on the camping trip, in the backyard. Let me close with this. So, God addresses Job, but this is only his first address to Job. We will examine his second address to Job next week. And that's good news for us, actually. Because maybe you're like me and you picked up on some loose ends. For instance, Job humbled himself, but he hadn't said anything about God. And there remains lingering questions about the puzzle of the problem of evil. And so Christopher Ash, again, says this. The puzzle is this. What about evil in the world? It's all very well for the Lord to be the good creator of a good world, but what about the world we actually have to live in? A good world touched by darkness and death. And this is the world we have to live in. It is the world Job lives in. It is the world any honest believer lives in. A world with pain, injustice, perplexity, and sorrow. What about that world? The real world. Well, next week, we will hear more from God about this problem and puzzle of evil. So maybe you have a friend who is struggling with the problem of evil. Consider bringing them with you next week. And let's together gather again next Sunday to hear from God himself.